Emily Carter had always believed that promises were meant to be kept. That belief had been shaped by her father long before she was old enough to understand what a promise truly meant. Every Sunday morning, regardless of the weather, he drove her to the old lighthouse overlooking Black Harbor. The road wound along steep cliffs where the Atlantic crashed endlessly against dark rocks. It was never an exciting trip by most people's standards. They climbed hundreds of narrow stairs, shared homemade sandwiches at the top, watched ships disappear over the horizon, and talked for hours. Sometimes they discussed school. Sometimes they imagined places they hoped to visit one day. Sometimes they sat in complete silence, simply listening to the waves below. Before every drive home, her father always reminded her that life changes and people change, but a promise made from the heart should never be abandoned without a fight. Emily carried those words with her for the rest of her life. When she was only 15 years old, everything changed. Her father suffered a sudden heart attack while returning home from work. He was gone before the ambulance reached the hospital. After the funeral, Emily never visited the lighthouse again. The place became too painful. It reminded her of everything she had lost. Years passed. Childhood slowly gave way to adulthood. Grief slowly transformed into determination. Emily buried herself in school, eventually earning a scholarship to one of the country's top universities, where she studied architecture. Designing buildings gave her something she desperately needed after losing her father. Control. Buildings could survive storms. Buildings could outlive people. Buildings could preserve memories long after those who created them were gone. She threw herself completely into her studies. Long nights in the design studio became normal. Coffee replaced sleep. Deadlines replaced weekends. She quickly became one of the most talented students in her class. That was where she met Noah Bennett. Noah studied civil engineering just one building away from the architecture department. Their first meeting happened entirely by accident. One evening a powerful snowstorm swept across campus far earlier than weather forecasts had predicted. Classes were cancelled. Students rushed toward buses before the roads became impassable. Emily stayed behind, determined to finish a presentation due the following morning. Hours passed without her noticing. Meanwhile, Noah had been working in the engineering library on bridge calculations for his senior project. When both finally tried leaving the building, they discovered every entrance had already been locked. Campus security believed the building was empty. Neither of them had enough phone battery to call anyone. Instead of becoming frustrated, Noah calmly searched the staff kitchen until he found an old electric kettle and several forgotten packets of instant coffee. Emily couldn't help laughing at how easily he seemed to know where everything was hidden. Noah admitted that engineering students had a habit of exploring every corner of a building and joked that he got lost so often he had learned preparation was the only way to survive. That unexpected night became the beginning of everything. They spent nearly 4 hours talking while snow buried the campus outside. Emily confessed that she dreamed of designing buildings people would remember for centuries rather than office towers that looked identical to every other skyscraper. Noah admitted that his greatest ambition wasn't becoming wealthy. He wanted to rebuild communities after natural disasters. He believed every family deserved a safe place to call home, regardless of how much money they had. Emily found his dream strangely beautiful. Most engineering students dreamed about record-breaking bridges or famous skylines. Noah dreamed about helping strangers. When sunrise finally arrived and security unlocked the doors, both felt oddly disappointed. Neither wanted the conversation to end. From that morning forward, they became inseparable. At first they studied together several evenings each week. Soon they were eating lunch together almost every day. Within months they no longer needed excuses to spend time together. Friends often joked that they behaved like an old married couple before they had even started dating. 3 years later, Noah proposed during a quiet weekend trip along the Maine coastline. There were no photographers. No expensive restaurant. No audience. Only crashing waves, cold sea air, and a small silver ring that Noah admitted he had carried in his pocket for nearly 2 months because he could never find the perfect moment. Emily laughed through tears before saying yes. They returned to Boston convinced the hardest part of life was already behind them. They rented a small apartment overlooking the Charles River. It wasn't luxurious. The kitchen was tiny. The heating system made strange noises every winter. The elevator rarely worked. But they loved it. They spent evenings choosing paint colors for rooms they hoped to own someday. They argued playfully over furniture they couldn't yet afford. Every paycheck brought another small purchase for the future. A dining table. Bookshelves. Kitchen appliances still sitting unopened inside their original boxes. Little by little, they built a life together long before their wedding day arrived. The ceremony was scheduled for early autumn. Invitations had already been mailed. Emily had chosen her dress. Noah had finalized every detail with the venue. Everything appeared certain. Then, one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Noah received a phone call that changed both of their lives forever. A devastating hurricane had destroyed several coastal communities in Louisiana. Entire neighborhoods had vanished beneath floodwaters. Schools had collapsed. Roads had become rivers. Hospitals operated using emergency generators while thousands of families waited desperately for help. Noah's engineering company had been asked to organize one of the largest emergency reconstruction projects in the region. Experienced structural engineers were urgently needed. Volunteers had only a few hours to decide. Noah didn't answer immediately. He spent the evening sitting beside Emily in their apartment, explaining what the mission involved. He knew how dangerous disaster zones could be. He also knew people desperately needed experienced engineers to make damaged buildings safe again. Emily never tried to stop him. She understood why he felt responsible. Helping people wasn't simply part of his profession. It was part of who he was. The night before his departure, rain tapped softly against the apartment windows while two packed suitcases waited beside the front door. Noah assured Emily that the assignment would last no more than 3 months. He promised that he would return before autumn leaves covered the streets of Boston and that the very first thing they would do together would be to finish preparing for their wedding. Emily smiled, reminded him that she expected him to keep that promise, and Noah looked into her eyes with complete confidence before promising that he would. The following morning, Emily stood at the airport watching him disappear beyond security. She had no idea that it would be the last time she would see him for many years. For the first few days after Noah arrived in Louisiana, everything seemed normal. The recovery mission was exactly what everyone had expected. Bridges needed inspection. Schools required structural assessments. Apartment buildings had to be examined before families could safely return. Every evening, Noah called Emily. Sometimes the conversations lasted nearly an hour. Sometimes only a few minutes because emergency work continued long after sunset. None of that bothered Emily. She knew why he was there. She had fallen in love with a man who could never ignore people in need. The calls became part of her daily routine. She finished work at the architecture firm around 6, stopped at the same cafe on her walk home, made dinner for 2 even though she ate alone, and waited for Noah's familiar voice. He always asked about her projects first. She always asked whether he had remembered to eat something besides energy bars and vending machine snacks. He usually laughed and admitted he hadn't. 3 weeks passed quickly. Then the calls became less frequent. Not because Noah wanted them to. The rebuilding teams were constantly moved between isolated towns where phone service barely existed. Sometimes 2 or 3 days passed without any signal. Emily worried, but every time Noah eventually managed to call, he sounded exhausted yet optimistic. He described children helping volunteers clean playgrounds covered in mud. He talked about elderly couples refusing to abandon homes that no longer had roofs because those houses still contained decades of memories. He told stories about complete strangers sharing generators, food, blankets, and anything else they had left. The news only shows destruction, he told Emily one evening. It never shows the people rebuilding each other. Emily listened quietly. She could hear generators humming in the background. Voices shouted somewhere nearby. Metal clanged against metal. Disaster had its own soundtrack. "I miss you," she admitted. "I know. When are you coming home?" "Soon. You always say that. This time I mean it." She smiled despite herself. "You meant it every other time too." He laughed. "I guess I did." Before hanging up, Noah reminded her to keep working on the wedding plans because he intended to be back before she realized how quiet the apartment had become. Emily promised she would. Neither of them knew it would be their last conversation. 3 days later, Hurricane Evelyn unexpectedly changed direction. Meteorologists had predicted it would remain far out in the Gulf. Instead, it strengthened overnight into one of the most violent storms of the decade. The emergency rebuilding teams received evacuation orders immediately. Most volunteers reached safety. Some didn't. That afternoon Emily sat through a meeting with several clients discussing a new museum project in downtown Boston. Halfway through the presentation her phone vibrated. She ignored it. A minute later it rang again. Then again. Finally, she excused herself. The number belonged to Noah's company. A cold feeling settled deep inside her chest before she even answered. The human resources director spoke calmly, carefully choosing every word. A temporary bridge had collapsed during the evacuation. Several engineers were swept into floodwaters. Rescue teams were still searching. Communication throughout the region had completely failed. No one knew exactly who had survived. Emily barely remembered the rest of the conversation. She drove home without turning on the radio. Without noticing traffic. Without remembering the route. She simply arrived. The apartment looked exactly as they had left it. Noah's favorite jacket still hung beside the front door. His running shoes waited neatly underneath the hallway bench. A grocery list remained attached to the refrigerator with a small lighthouse-shaped magnet. Milk. Eggs. Coffee. Pasta. Normal things. Ordinary things. She stared at the list until the words blurred. The following morning she boarded the first flight to Louisiana. The airport resembled a military base more than a civilian terminal. Emergency workers, doctors, firefighters, engineers, and National Guard personnel crowded every gate. Television screens showed endless images of flooded towns. Helicopters. Collapsed roads. Families standing on rooftops waiting for rescue. Emily reached the Disaster Response Center by evening. Hundreds of volunteers moved constantly between tents carrying maps, supplies, and medical equipment. Someone finally guided her toward a temporary office where missing personnel were being identified. She waited nearly 4 hours before anyone spoke to her. An exhausted rescue coordinator unfolded a map across the table. The bridge failed here. He pointed toward a river swollen far beyond its normal banks. We've recovered 6 members of the team. Emily held her breath. And Noah? The coordinator hesitated. He hasn't been found. Hope and fear collided instantly. Not found. Those 2 words meant everything and nothing at the same time. For the next 12 days Emily refused to leave Louisiana. Every morning she joined families waiting for updates. Every afternoon helicopters returned from search missions. Every evening new lists appeared. Recovered. Hospitalized. Identified. Transferred. Noah's name never appeared. On the 13th day the official search ended. Authorities concluded that the remaining missing workers had most likely been carried into the Gulf by powerful flood currents. Death certificates would be issued after the required legal process. Emily refused to sign anything. She returned to Boston carrying Noah's backpack. Inside she found a notebook filled with bridge sketches. A flashlight. Several photographs of damaged neighborhoods. The silver watch she had given him for his birthday. And, tucked carefully between 2 pages of engineering notes. Their wedding vows. Handwritten. Folded. Still unfinished. Emily read them only once. Then carefully placed them back inside the notebook. She couldn't bear to finish reading what he had never been able to say. Autumn arrived exactly as Noah had promised. The leaves changed color. Boston turned shades of gold and crimson. Wedding invitations began returning unopened because guests had heard the news. The ceremony was quietly cancelled. The apartment became unbearably silent. Yet every evening, just before going to bed, Emily found herself glancing at her phone. For one impossible second. She still expected it to ring. Winter arrived early that year. Boston was covered in snow long before Thanksgiving decorations disappeared from storefronts. Christmas lights appeared across the city, but Emily barely noticed them. She threw herself into work with a determination that worried everyone around her. She arrived at the architecture firm before sunrise. She left long after the cleaning staff. Projects multiplied. Deadlines became excuses. If she stayed busy enough, she didn't have to think. At least that was what she kept telling herself. Friends invited her to dinner. She politely declined. Her mother called almost every evening. Emily always insisted she was fine. She wasn't. The apartment slowly transformed into something that resembled a museum. Noah's books remained exactly where he had left them. His favorite coffee mug stayed on the kitchen shelf. His winter coat still hung beside the front door. Every object became impossible to move. Not because she believed he would come back. Because removing them felt like admitting he never would. Months passed. Then years. Life continued moving whether Emily wanted it to or not. She became one of the youngest senior architects in her company. Her designs won national awards. She traveled across Europe supervising international projects. Magazine interviews described her as brilliant, disciplined, and visionary. Journalists often asked what inspired her work. Emily always gave the same answer. She said that every building should make people feel safe. No one knew why those words mattered so much to her. No one knew they had belonged to Noah first. 5 years after the hurricane, Emily finally packed away the unopened wedding gifts. It took her an entire weekend. Some boxes still carried handwritten notes from friends who had expected to celebrate the happiest day of her life. She donated almost everything. The dishes. The kitchen appliances. The crystal glasses. The expensive cookware. Only one box remained. Inside rested Noah's notebook. The unfinished wedding vows. The silver watch she had once given him. And the engagement ring she had never been able to wear again. She closed the lid. Placed it in the back of her closet. And told herself it was finally time to move forward. She tried. She really did. Over the following years she agreed to several dates arranged by friends. Every man she met was kind. Successful. Interesting. Yet something never felt right. One man loved traveling more than anything else. Another spent weekends restoring antique cars. A third worked as a history professor with an endless collection of fascinating stories. Emily genuinely enjoyed their company. But every conversation quietly reminded her of someone else. Someone who laughed whenever coffee spilled across blueprints. Someone who stopped to help strangers without thinking twice. Someone who believed rebuilding a single family's home mattered just as much as designing the world's tallest skyscraper. Eventually she stopped dating altogether. It wasn't fair to compare people to a memory. Especially one frozen in time. 10 years passed. Black Harbor Lighthouse remained only a distant childhood memory. Emily hadn't visited since her father's death. Until one autumn afternoon. She had spent the weekend driving aimlessly along the Massachusetts coastline after completing a difficult museum project. Without consciously deciding to, she found herself turning onto the familiar coastal road. The lighthouse appeared exactly as she remembered. White stone walls. Black lantern room. The endless Atlantic stretching toward the horizon. Only the wooden benches had changed. They were newer now. She climbed the spiral staircase slowly. Each step awakened memories she thought had disappeared. Her father's laughter echoing through the tower. His hand resting gently on her shoulder while teaching her how ships navigated at night. His quiet voice reminding her that promises only mattered when people chose to keep them. At the top stood an elderly lighthouse keeper sweeping fallen leaves from the observation deck. He smiled warmly. Beautiful day. Emily nodded. It is. You've been here before. It wasn't a question. She looked surprised. How could you tell? People visiting for the first time spend all their time looking at the ocean. He leaned against the railing. People returning after many years spend their time looking at memories. Emily smiled faintly. I suppose you're right. The old man introduced himself as Thomas. He had maintained the lighthouse for almost 30 years. Before Emily left, he handed her a small visitor's notebook. Most people write their names. She accepted the pen. Instead of writing only her signature, she found herself writing a single sentence. Some promises survive longer than the people who made them. Thomas read the words after she closed the notebook. He looked toward the sea for a long moment before quietly saying that sometimes the people they believed they had lost were simply taking longer than expected to find their way home. Emily smiled politely. She appreciated the kindness. But she no longer believed in impossible endings. As she drove back toward Boston that evening, rain began falling across the highway. Her phone rang through the car's speakers. The number was unfamiliar. She almost ignored it. Almost. Something made her answer. A calm male voice introduced himself as Detective Michael Harris from the Louisiana State Police. Emily tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The detective apologized for contacting her without warning. Then he explained that a hurricane-damaged warehouse scheduled for demolition had recently been cleared for the first time in more than a decade. During the cleanup, workers discovered a locked metal storage case hidden beneath collapsed concrete. Inside were several personal belongings belonging to emergency engineers from the original rescue mission. Among them, they had found Noah Bennett's identification, his engineering license, and something else. A waterproof notebook containing a message addressed specifically to Emily Carter. For the first time in 10 years, Emily's heart dared to hope. Even if only for a single impossible moment. Emily didn't remember pulling the car onto the shoulder. One moment she was driving through steady rain. The next, she was sitting motionless with both hands gripping the steering wheel while the detective's words echoed through the speakers. A notebook. Addressed to her. Hidden for more than 10 years. She finally found her voice. "Are you certain it belonged to Noah?" "Yes," Detective Harris replied calmly. "His engineering license was inside the same waterproof case. We also confirmed the serial number on his company identification." Emily closed her eyes. "So, he wrote something?" "Yes." "Can you read it to me?" "I'm afraid I can't." "Why not?" There was a brief pause. "Because it's considered personal property. We'd prefer to return it directly to you." Emily looked through the windshield as rain rolled slowly down the glass. "When?" "As soon as possible. I'll fly down tomorrow." "You don't have to." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "We're already sending someone to Boston. There are a few additional questions we'd like to ask." "Questions?" The word settled uneasily in her mind. "What kind of questions?" "I'm sorry, Miss Carter. I'd rather discuss them in person." After ending the call, Emily remained parked beside the highway for nearly 20 minutes. Her thoughts refused to slow down. For 10 years she had believed every answer had already been buried beneath floodwaters. Now suddenly, there was a notebook. A message. Questions. Nothing made sense. The following morning she barely managed to concentrate at work. Blueprints covered her desk. Emails continued arriving. Meetings filled her calendar. She accomplished almost nothing. Every few minutes she glanced toward the office entrance. Shortly after 3 in the afternoon, her assistant quietly knocked on the door. "Emily." She looked up. "There's someone here asking for you." Detective Michael Harris looked exactly as she had imagined. Early 50s. Calm eyes. Gray beginning to appear along the edges of his dark hair. He carried a worn leather briefcase beneath one arm. After brief introductions, they moved into a private conference room. Without saying a word, Harris carefully placed a sealed evidence envelope on the table. Emily stared at it. Inside lay a small black notebook, faded by time but remarkably well preserved. Beside it rested Noah's engineering license. His identification badge. A silver wedding band. Emily frowned. Wedding band? She looked at the detective. He wasn't married. Harris nodded. "We know." Emily carefully opened the evidence bag. The notebook felt surprisingly ordinary. Its cover was scratched. Corners slightly worn. Nothing about it suggested it had spent a decade hidden beneath concrete. She opened the first page. Immediately she recognized Noah's handwriting. "Emily. If you're reading this, then something went terribly wrong." Her vision blurred. She continued. "I'm writing during a short break while we're reinforcing the Eastern Bridge. The weather forecast changed again. Everyone says another storm is forming. They're telling us not to worry. Engineers are terrible at following that advice. Despite everything, Emily smiled. That sounded exactly like Noah. The pages that followed described the rebuilding mission. Families who refuse to leave damaged neighborhoods. Children drawing pictures on temporary shelter walls. Volunteers working 18-hour days without complaint. Every page reflected the same quiet optimism Noah had always carried. Then, the tone changed. Something strange happened today. Emily's heartbeat quickened. We inspected an abandoned warehouse scheduled for demolition. Inside we found several people hiding. Not families. Not survivors. Men moving stolen emergency supplies. Emily looked up. Detective Harris remained silent. She kept reading. When they realized we had seen them, everything changed. The next several pages had been torn out. Cleanly. Deliberately. Emily flipped forward. The writing resumed several days later. Only this time it was rushed. Uneven. Almost frantic. If anyone finds this, don't let them call it an accident. The bridge didn't simply fail. Emily froze. Every sound inside the conference room disappeared. Someone weakened the support beams before evacuation began. Too many people knew expensive reconstruction contracts depended on greater damage. I reported everything. I don't know who I can trust anymore. Emily slowly lowered the notebook. No. Detective Harris folded his hands quietly. The missing pages were never recovered. She stared at him. Are you telling me? We're telling you we recently reopened the original investigation. Emily could barely breathe. For 10 years everyone believed the bridge collapse resulted from flood damage. Harris nodded. Recent forensic analysis suggests otherwise. He slid a thin folder across the table. Newspaper clippings. Engineering reports. Photographs. Several names highlighted in yellow. One photograph caught Emily's attention immediately. The abandoned warehouse Noah had mentioned. Its roof had completely collapsed. The detective spoke carefully. Construction crews only reached the lower storage level 2 months ago. And the notebook? It was hidden inside a sealed emergency toolbox. Emily looked down again. Noah hadn't simply written goodbye. He had left evidence. Evidence no one had found for 10 years. She looked back at the detective. But none of this explains one thing. What? She swallowed. If Noah discovered sabotage, why was only his notebook found? The detective's expression changed almost imperceptibly. That's exactly the question we're trying to answer. Silence settled over the room. Outside the conference room window, Boston continued moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened. People hurried along sidewalks. Traffic crawled through intersections. Life remained ordinary. Inside, Emily's entire understanding of the past had just shattered. For the first time in 10 years. She wasn't mourning a tragedy anymore. She was standing at the beginning of a mystery. Emily didn't sleep that night. The notebook lay open on her dining table while the city outside slowly disappeared beneath a blanket of rain. Every few hours she reread Noah's words, hoping they would somehow reveal something she had missed. They never did. The missing pages haunted her more than the words that remained. Someone had removed them. Not accidentally. Carefully. Intentionally. By sunrise she had made her decision. She wasn't going to let the story end there. The following morning Emily called Detective Harris before leaving for work. I want to help. There was a brief silence on the other end. I thought you might. What do you need from me? For now, memories. She frowned. Memories? Anything Noah mentioned during the weeks before communication stopped. Emily closed her eyes. At first nothing seemed important. Conversations about damaged bridges. Children helping volunteers. Long workdays. Power outages. Then. She remembered something. There was one phone call. Harris waited. He sounded different. In what way? He kept looking over his shoulder. You could hear that? I couldn't hear it. She shook her head, almost speaking to herself. I could feel it. She remembered the conversation perfectly. The line had been unusually quiet. No machinery. No voices. Only wind. Noah had lowered his voice several times as though he didn't want someone nearby to overhear him. At the time she assumed people were sleeping. Now. She wasn't so sure. He asked me something strange. What was it? Emily searched her memory. He asked if I still kept copies of every blueprint I ever designed. Harris immediately became interested. Did he explain why? No. I laughed because it seemed like such a random question. And then? He told me to keep doing it. Emily frowned. He said that one day the smallest detail could explain everything. The detective remained silent for several seconds. That's exactly how engineers think. Emily looked through her apartment window toward the Charles River. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Noah believed someone was hiding evidence. After ending the call, Emily couldn't concentrate on anything else. That evening she opened an old storage cabinet she hadn't touched in years. Inside were dozens of boxes containing notebooks, project sketches, photographs, university assignments, and old folders from the years she and Noah had lived together. Dust covered almost everything. She wasn't sure what she hoped to find. Probably nothing. Hours passed. One box contained vacation photographs. Another held wedding invitations that had never been mailed to distant relatives. A third contained receipts for furniture they had planned to buy after returning from their honeymoon. Then she found an old laptop. It belonged to Noah. She had completely forgotten about it. The battery was long dead, but after connecting the charger, the screen slowly came to life. The wallpaper immediately made her smile. It was a photograph of Black Harbor Lighthouse. He had secretly taken the picture during one of their weekend trips. Emily entered the password almost automatically. Her birthday. The desktop looked untouched. Engineering software. Bridge simulations. Hundreds of project folders. Nothing unusual. Until she noticed one directory she had never seen before. Its name was simple. Promise. She clicked. Empty. At least. It appeared empty. Only one file remained. A plain text document titled, If Needed. Emily opened it. The page contained only one sentence. If you're reading this, then I was right not to trust company email. Her heart began racing. Below the sentence appeared a string of random letters and numbers. No explanation. No instructions. Just 24 seemingly meaningless characters. She stared at them. They looked familiar. Not because she recognized the code itself. Because Noah had used similar strings before. Encryption keys. During college he often protected engineering projects with homemade encryption software because classmates occasionally copied assignments. Emily suddenly understood. This wasn't a message. It was a password. But for what? She searched the computer again. Nothing. No hidden folders. No encrypted archives. No unusual files. Everything else appeared completely ordinary. She called Detective Harris immediately. I found something. An hour later he arrived at her apartment carrying a laptop of his own. He examined the code carefully. This definitely isn't random. You think it's encrypted? I know it is. He compared it with several databases before shaking his head. It's not a company password. It's personal. Emily leaned forward. What does that mean? It means Noah expected someone he trusted to recognize it. She looked at the sequence again. 24 characters. Letters. Numbers. No pattern. Then something caught her attention. The first 4 letters. BHLT. Black Harbor Lighthouse. Her father's favorite place. She whispered the words aloud. Detective Harris looked at her. What did you say? Emily stood so suddenly that her chair nearly fell backward. It's not random. She grabbed a notebook and quickly wrote the letters down. BHLT. Then the next numbers. 714. July 14th. The date her father first took her to the lighthouse after her 10th birthday. She continued separating the remaining characters. Each group represented something from their lives. Places. Dates. Coordinates. Memories only Noah and Emily shared. It wasn't a password. It was a map. Not of roads. Of memories. Every piece pointed toward a different location connected to their relationship. The final group of characters translated into one place neither of them had visited for years. A train depot outside New Orleans. The very place where Noah's engineering team had stored equipment before the hurricane. Detective Harris slowly looked up from the notebook. That depot. Emily met his eyes. Was never searched. Silence filled the apartment. Outside, thunder rolled across the Boston skyline. For the second time in less than 48 hours. The past had opened another door. And this one pointed toward a place where someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep a secret buried. Emily and Detective Harris were on the first flight to New Orleans the following morning. Neither spoke much during the journey. Emily spent most of the flight staring through the airplane window, watching the clouds drift beneath them. For more than 10 years she had believed she was traveling toward closure. Now she realized she was traveling toward answers. Whether she was ready for those answers was another question entirely. The train depot stood nearly 20 miles outside the city. It had once served as a logistics center during the hurricane recovery effort. Today it looked abandoned. Rust covered the old steel fences. Weeds pushed through cracked concrete. Most of the warehouses had already been demolished. Only one large brick building remained standing. Detective Harris parked beside the entrance. According to county records, the building had changed ownership 4 different times over the past decade. Each company had existed for less than 2 years before quietly dissolving. Emily frowned. That seems suspicious. It is. Harris locked the car. But proving suspicion is much harder than noticing it. Inside, the depot smelled of dust and damp concrete. Sunlight filtered through broken skylights high above the ceiling. Old railway tracks still crossed the warehouse floor before disappearing beneath piles of abandoned equipment. Most of the building was completely empty. Only a few forgotten shipping containers remained near the western wall. Emily slowly walked forward. Something felt strangely familiar. She couldn't explain why. Then she remembered. Noah had once shown her photographs from this place while preparing for the recovery mission. The warehouse had served as the engineering team's equipment center. Every morning trucks departed from here carrying generators, steel beams, medical supplies, and temporary bridge sections. She closed her eyes, trying to picture the old photographs. There. She pointed toward the far corner. There used to be office trailers. Harris compared the room to an old blueprint. You've got a good memory. They're gone now. Not completely. He pointed toward faint rectangular outlines still visible on the concrete floor. The trailers had been removed years earlier. Their footprints remained. They spent nearly 2 hours searching the building. Nothing. Broken tools. Empty filing cabinets. Water-damaged shelves. Every clue seemed to end before it began. Emily sat on an overturned crate, exhausted. What if we're too late? Harris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he continued examining one wall covered by faded emergency evacuation maps. Most had peeled away long ago. One remained attached by a single rusted nail. He gently lifted the edge. Behind it someone had written several numbers directly onto the concrete with black marker. Coordinates. Emily immediately recognized them. They're not local. Harris entered them into his tablet. A satellite map appeared. The coordinates pointed toward a small piece of land several miles east of the depot. An island. Barely visible among the wetlands. Emily looked confused. There's nothing there. Today, no. Harris zoomed into an archived satellite image from 12 years earlier. A temporary emergency operations center appeared on the island. Portable offices. Storage tents. Communication towers. Everything had been dismantled after the hurricane. Emily's pulse quickened. Why hide coordinates behind a map? Harris looked at her. Because someone expected the building to be searched. But not carefully. They drove toward the wetlands immediately. The final mile could only be crossed by a narrow wooden bridge that looked as though it hadn't been repaired in years. Beyond it stood the island. Nature had almost completely reclaimed it. Tall grass covered the foundations of old temporary buildings. Trees had begun growing through cracked asphalt. Only fragments of concrete remained where offices once stood. The place felt forgotten. Exactly the kind of place where secrets survived. Emily wandered slowly across what had once been the operations center. Most structures had vanished. Rain and time had erased nearly everything. Then she noticed something unusual. One concrete foundation contained a metal hatch almost completely hidden beneath vines. Harris. He hurried over. Together they cleared away years of dirt and vegetation. The hatch was locked. But the lock had long since rusted beyond repair. After several minutes of effort, it finally gave way. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. The air below felt cool and dry. Detective Harris switched on his flashlight. A small underground storage room appeared. Rows of shelves lined the walls. Most were empty. One shelf wasn't. A single waterproof storage case rested in the center of the room. Exactly like the one that had contained Noah's notebook. Emily's hands trembled. Harris carefully opened the container. Inside lay several sealed folders. A portable hard drive. Dozens of photographs. And one envelope. Across the front, written in Noah's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words. If Emily finds this, open first. Emily stared at the envelope without moving. She had imagined hearing Noah's voice again for more than a decade. Now it waited inside a simple white envelope. She carefully broke the seal. The letter inside was only 1 page long. Emily. If you've reached this place, then someone finally followed the trail I left behind. That means 2 things. First, the truth survived. Second, there's still hope. Because if you're reading this, I'm almost certainly still alive. Emily stopped breathing. The paper slipped slightly in her hands. She looked up at Detective Harris. Neither of them spoke. For 11 years she had lived with grief. For the last 2 days she had lived with questions. Now, for the first time in her life, she was living with something even more terrifying. Hope. Emily read the final sentence again. Then a third time. The words refused to make sense. I'm almost certainly still alive. Her hands began to shake so violently that Detective Harris gently took the letter before it slipped onto the damp concrete floor. He read the page silently. When he finished, he looked at Emily with the same disbelief she felt. If this letter is genuine. Emily interrupted him. It is. You recognize the handwriting? I've recognized it for 15 years. She wasn't simply recognizing handwriting. She recognized the way Noah thought. Even under impossible circumstances, he never wasted words. If he had written that sentence, he had believed it. Harris carefully examined the envelope. No postmark. No date. He must have left it here himself. Emily nodded slowly. He expected someone to find it eventually. But not soon. The detective opened the remaining folders inside the storage case. Each one contained engineering reports, photographs, handwritten notes, and copies of financial records. At first glance, they appeared unrelated. Then patterns emerged. Several construction companies repeatedly appeared on different contracts. The same executives signed emergency rebuilding agreements worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Bridge inspections had been altered. Safety reports had been rewritten. Entire pages carried forged signatures. Emily stared at the documents. This wasn't random corruption. Harris agreed. No. This was organized. One photograph immediately caught Emily's attention. It showed Noah standing beside 3 other engineers during the first week of the rebuilding mission. All 4 were smiling. She recognized only Noah. Harris turned the photograph over. Each person had been identified. Noah Bennett. Carlos Mendoza. Rachel Kim. Ethan Brooks. Emily frowned. I've never heard these names. They were reported dead. Were they? Harris looked thoughtful. Officially. He placed the photograph beside the letter. If Noah survived. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Emily understood. If Noah had survived. Perhaps someone else had too. Among the remaining documents they discovered a small flash drive wrapped carefully inside waterproof plastic. Unlike everything else, it carried no label. Harris slipped it into his laptop. Several encrypted folders appeared immediately. A password was required. Emily smiled faintly. I think I know where to start. She typed the sequence they had decoded from Noah's laptop. The screen paused. Then one folder unlocked. Hundreds of files filled the display. Emails. Scanned contracts. Photographs. Financial transactions. Voice recordings. Everything had been meticulously organized. Almost obsessively. Noah hadn't simply collected evidence. He had built an entire case. One audio file stood apart from the others. Its title consisted of only one word. Insurance. Emily clicked it. Static filled the speakers. Then Noah's voice emerged. Slightly older. Tired. But unmistakably his. If you're listening to this, then something happened to me. Emily covered her mouth. Hearing his voice after 11 years felt almost unbearable. I don't know who will find these files. I hope it's Emily. If it isn't. Please make sure she knows I never broke my promise. Emily closed her eyes. Tears rolled silently down her face. The recording continued. 3 days after we arrived, several members of our engineering team discovered construction materials disappearing from secured warehouses. We reported the shortages. Management blamed accounting errors. But the numbers kept changing. We started checking deliveries ourselves. Another voice interrupted. One Emily didn't recognize. You really think someone's stealing disaster supplies? Noah answered immediately. I think someone's creating shortages. The unknown man laughed nervously. Why? Because rebuilding destroyed bridges is expensive. A pause. Rebuilding bridges that never needed to collapse is worth a fortune. Silence followed. Then Noah spoke again. If anything happens to us, it won't be because of the hurricane. The recording ended. Nobody spoke for several moments. Finally Harris closed the laptop. This changes everything. Emily nodded slowly. He knew. He knew they were in danger. He stayed anyway. Because people would have died. Harris looked at her with quiet respect. He sounds exactly like the man you described. Emily smiled through tears. That's because he was. They packed every document into evidence containers before leaving the underground room. Outside, evening sunlight spread across the wetlands. Birds circled overhead. The entire island seemed peaceful. Almost untouched. It was difficult to believe that a secret hidden beneath its soil could rewrite 11 years of history. As they walked back toward the bridge, Harris's phone rang. He answered immediately. His expression changed within seconds. What happened? Emily asked. He lowered the phone slowly. The lab finished analyzing fingerprints from the storage case. Emily waited. There were recent prints. Her heart skipped. How recent? Less than 6 months old. Emily stared at him. That's impossible. No. Harris looked toward the abandoned island behind them. It means someone came back. Someone knew this place still existed. Emily swallowed hard. And maybe. She couldn't finish the thought. Harris did it for her. Maybe Noah wasn't the last person to open that box. Far away, beyond the wetlands, the evening train sounded its lonely horn as it crossed an old railway bridge. For the second time in her life, Emily found herself chasing a man the world believed had disappeared. Only this time, she had proof that someone, somewhere, had been alive not very long ago. Detective Harris didn't wait until they returned to the hotel. He called the forensic laboratory while they were still driving away from the abandoned island. Emily sat silently in the passenger seat, watching marshlands disappear behind them. Her mind refused to settle. Recent fingerprints. Less than 6 months old. Someone had opened that storage case. Someone who knew exactly where it was hidden. The call lasted nearly 15 minutes. When Harris finally ended it, he exhaled slowly. "They're sending us the full report tonight." Emily looked at him. "Did they identify the fingerprints?" "Not yet. They aren't in the criminal database." He shook his head. "No match." Silence filled the car again. That wasn't good news. If the prints had belonged to a criminal, investigators might have identified them immediately. Instead, whoever had opened the box had never been arrested. Or their fingerprints had never been recorded. Neither possibility made Emily feel any better. Back at the hotel, Detective Harris spread every recovered document across the room. Photographs covered the bed. Financial records occupied the desk. Engineering reports formed neat stacks across the carpet. Emily helped organize everything by date. The deeper they looked, the stranger the timeline became. Several companies that had won emergency reconstruction contracts no longer existed. Each had declared bankruptcy within 2 years. Their executives had disappeared into other corporations. Money had moved through dozens of shell companies before finally ending in private offshore accounts. It wasn't just corruption, Harris murmured. It was planned years in advance. Emily stared at one contract. The signatures looked almost identical. Almost. Then she noticed one small difference. Noah would have seen this. Harris walked over. "What?" She pointed toward the engineering approval stamp. "The seal is wrong." He frowned. "It looks normal." "Not if you're an engineer." She searched through another folder until she found one of Noah's authentic inspection reports. "Look." The official seal contained 6 support bolts surrounding the bridge symbol. The forged version contained only 5. Such a tiny mistake. Almost invisible. Yet Noah would have noticed immediately. Harris nodded slowly. So that's how he knew documents were being falsified. Emily smiled sadly. He always noticed details everyone else ignored. Late that evening the forensic laboratory finally called. Harris placed the phone on speaker. The fingerprint analyst spoke carefully. There wasn't just one recent visitor. Emily looked toward the detective. "What do you mean?" "We recovered prints from 2 different people." 2. "Yes. The first set belongs to someone who opened the storage case roughly 4 to 6 months ago." "And the second?" The analyst hesitated. "The second set is less than 2 weeks old." Emily's heart nearly stopped. 2 weeks. That's our best estimate. Harris immediately asked the question both of them feared. Could those prints belong to investigators? "We checked. They don't." The room fell completely silent. Someone had visited the underground room only days before Emily arrived. Not months. Days. After ending the call, Harris stood by the hotel window for a long time. Finally he spoke. "We've got a problem." Emily already knew. "Someone knows we're getting close." The next morning they returned to the evidence room to examine every photograph again. Hours passed. Nothing new appeared. Until Emily picked up an image she had barely noticed before. It showed Noah's engineering team standing beside several pickup trucks during the first week after arriving in Louisiana. Everyone smiled for the camera. Behind them, almost hidden by construction equipment, stood another man. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't wearing an engineering uniform. He wore an expensive business suit. Completely inappropriate for a disaster zone. Emily handed the photograph to Harris. "Who's that?" The detective enlarged the image. The man's face remained blurry. But one detail stood out clearly. A silver lapel pin shaped like an eagle. Harris suddenly became very still. "I've seen that before." "Where?" He searched through the recovered contracts. After several minutes he found another photograph attached to a corporate report. Different year. Different location. Same pin. Same man. The caption identified him. Richard Calloway. Chief Executive Officer. Atlantic Infrastructure Group. Emily frowned. The company that won most of the rebuilding contracts. Harris nodded. The same company that disappeared 3 years later. Emily looked at the blurry face again. He was personally visiting disaster sites. Apparently. Doesn't that seem unusual? It does. Most CEOs rarely visited active construction zones. Especially dangerous ones. Yet Richard Calloway had. Emily continued studying the picture. Something else bothered her. Everyone else looked toward the camera. Calloway wasn't. He was looking directly at Noah. Not smiling. Watching him. As though he already knew Noah had become a problem. Before either of them could discuss it further, someone knocked sharply on the hotel room door. Both froze. Harris instinctively reached for the folder containing the recovered evidence. Another knock. Louder this time. Emily walked quietly toward the peephole. Outside stood a hotel employee holding a small package. No return address, the young receptionist explained when Emily opened the door slightly. It was left at the front desk about 10 minutes ago. Emily accepted the package. It was surprisingly light. Inside she found only one object. A disposable prepaid cell phone. Nothing else. No charger. No instructions. No note. The phone suddenly vibrated. An incoming call. Unknown number. Emily and Harris exchanged a long glance. Then she answered. Neither of them spoke. For several seconds, only static filled the line. Then. A man's quiet voice. Older than Noah's. Calm. Careful. If Detective Harris is with you. Emily felt every muscle in her body tense. Tell him to stop looking at the dead. The voice paused. If he wants the truth. He needs to start looking for the living. The line went dead. Emily stared at the phone. Her breathing became uneven. Harris slowly took the phone from her hand. Did you recognize the voice? She swallowed. No. But whoever it was. She looked toward the window where storm clouds were gathering over New Orleans. He knew exactly where we were. For the first time since this investigation began. It became painfully clear. They were no longer searching for the truth alone. Someone else had been watching them all along. Emily barely slept. The prepaid phone lay on the bedside table, powered off after Detective Harris removed its battery. The forensic team would examine it in the morning. Still, neither of them expected much. Disposable phones were designed to disappear. Whoever had called knew exactly how to avoid leaving a trail. The message replayed endlessly in Emily's mind. Stop looking at the dead. Start looking for the living. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like advice. That somehow made it even more unsettling. At sunrise, Harris received a call from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. News of the recovered documents had spread faster than either of them expected. The evidence suggested fraud involving hundreds of millions of dollars in federal disaster relief funds. The case was no longer just a state investigation. Federal agents wanted to join. Emily expected Harris to sound relieved. Instead, he hesitated. Too many people know now. She looked at him. Isn't that a good thing? Usually. But the more people involved, the harder it becomes to know who you can trust. An hour later they met Special Agent Laura Mitchell. She was in her early 40s, spoke very little, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent years questioning people who preferred not to answer. She listened carefully while Harris explained everything they had discovered. The notebook. The hidden storage room. The recordings. The recent fingerprints. When he finished, Mitchell remained silent for a moment. Then she asked one simple question. Has anyone checked Noah Bennett's financial records after he disappeared? Emily frowned. What do you mean? If Noah died during the hurricane, every financial account connected to him should have stopped. She opened a folder. But if someone stayed alive? Money has a way of revealing it. Within hours they obtained court authorization to review Noah's old accounts. Emily already knew what they would find. Nothing. His checking account had remained untouched for more than 11 years. His savings account had been frozen after he was declared legally dead. His credit cards had never been used again. Exactly what everyone expected. Then Mitchell requested something different. What about his social security number? The analyst searched another database. Several seconds passed. Then he frowned. That's strange. Everyone looked toward his monitor. What? There was activity. Emily's pulse quickened. When? 8 months ago. The room fell silent. The analyst enlarged the record. Someone had attempted to verify Noah Bennett's identity while applying for temporary medical treatment at a free clinic in northern Texas. The request had been rejected because Noah had already been listed as deceased. No further information appeared. Only one detail remained. A security camera had recorded everyone entering the clinic that day. Mitchell immediately requested the footage. Unfortunately, the clinic only stored recordings for 90 days. Everything older had been erased automatically. Emily lowered her head. So close. Mitchell wasn't discouraged. Not necessarily. She pointed toward another line in the report. The application included fingerprints. Everyone looked up. The analyst quickly searched the database. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, a match appeared. Emily stopped breathing. The fingerprints belonged to the same unknown person who had opened the hidden storage case 4 to 6 months earlier. Harris leaned closer. So the person visiting the storage room also used Noah's identity. Mitchell nodded. Which means one of two things. Someone stole his identity. Emily whispered the second possibility before Mitchell could. Or Noah used his own. No one spoke. Neither possibility could be dismissed. Later that afternoon, another discovery complicated everything. The forensic team successfully recovered deleted data from the prepaid phone. Only one contact number had ever been stored. No name. Just digits. The number belonged to a motel outside San Antonio, Texas. Mitchell called immediately. The motel manager answered after several rings. He sounded confused by the questions. Eventually he admitted something unexpected. Yes. A quiet middle-aged man had rented room 17 for almost 6 months. He always paid in cash. Never caused problems. Kept mostly to himself. Emily's heart raced. Did he give a name? The manager checked his records. He signed as Nathan Brooks. Mitchell looked at Harris instantly. Emily recognized the reaction. What? Harris slowly turned the old engineering team photograph toward her. 4 names. Noah Bennett. Carlos Mendoza. Rachel Kim. Ethan Brooks. Emily frowned. Nathan Brooks. Mitchell nodded. Too similar to be coincidence. The manager continued speaking. The strange thing is, he disappeared last week. Emily felt cold. Disappeared? He packed everything overnight. Left before sunrise. Didn't even ask for his deposit back. Mitchell thanked him and ended the call. Nobody moved. Finally Harris broke the silence. Someone warned him. Emily looked toward the prepaid phone lying inside an evidence bag. Or. She paused. He was the one who called. Mitchell considered that possibility. If he wanted to disappear, why contact you at all? Emily didn't have an answer. But one thought refused to leave her mind. Whoever had called hadn't tried to stop the investigation. He had pointed them toward it. As evening approached, the three of them spread a large map across the conference table. Boston. Louisiana. Texas. Every confirmed clue formed an uneven line stretching across the country. Mitchell circled San Antonio. If we're lucky. Someone there remembers Nathan Brooks. If we're unlucky? Harris asked. Mitchell looked at both of them. We're chasing a man who's spent 11 years making sure nobody could find him. Emily stared at the map. For more than a decade she had believed Noah had been taken by a storm. Now another possibility stood before her. What if the storm had only been the beginning? 2 days later, Emily, Detective Harris, and Special Agent Mitchell landed in San Antonio. The Texas heat felt almost unreal after the humid air of Louisiana. The city bustled with ordinary life. Morning traffic filled the highways. Families hurried into restaurants for breakfast. Joggers passed beneath rows of oak trees. No one around them had any idea they were searching for a man the world believed had died 11 years earlier. Their first stop was the small roadside motel. It wasn't much to look at. 2 aging buildings. A faded neon sign that flickered even in daylight. A cracked swimming pool that hadn't held water in years. Room 17 sat at the far end of the property. The manager unlocked the door. We haven't rented it since he left. The room was almost empty. A bed. A wooden chair. A small television from another decade. Everything had been cleaned. Nothing personal remained. Emily slowly walked inside. For some reason, she had imagined feeling closer to Noah. Instead, the room felt painfully anonymous. Whoever had lived here had made sure to leave no trace behind. Mitchell searched the bathroom while Harris examined the furniture. Emily stood quietly beside the window. Outside, an old railroad crossed the edge of the property. Every few minutes another freight train rolled past. She smiled sadly. Noah had always loved trains. Not because they were fast. Because they connected places. He used to say every railway existed because someone believed 2 distant places deserved to meet. Her eyes drifted toward the windowsill. Something caught the sunlight. A tiny scratch. No. Letters. Very faint. Someone had carved them into the painted wood. She leaned closer. There were only 3 words. Still keeping promises. Emily stopped breathing. Her fingertips traced the shallow engraving. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Not because of the letters themselves. Because Noah had always carved the capital P with a small curve at the bottom, a habit he had developed as a teenager after copying his father's signature. She had teased him about it for years. No one else wrote it that way. Harris. The detective walked over. What is it? She pointed silently. He crouched beside the window. Can you be certain? Emily nodded without hesitation. He was here. Mitchell photographed the engraving before turning toward the motel manager. When did room 17 get repainted? The older man scratched his head. About 7 months ago. And the windowsill? We never touched it. Emily looked at the faded words again. If Noah had carved them. He had done it recently. Very recently. Mitchell questioned the manager for nearly an hour. Most answers led nowhere. Yes, the man kept to himself. Yes, he always paid cash. Yes, he left before sunrise. Then the manager remembered something unexpected. There was one place he visited every Sunday. Mitchell looked up. Where? The public library. Emily blinked. The library? The manager nodded. Strange, I know. He never borrowed books. He just sat in a history section for hours. An hour later they arrived at the downtown library. The building was quiet. Sunlight streamed through enormous windows. A librarian named Maria greeted them warmly. After seeing Mitchell's credentials, she searched the visitor logs. We don't normally record names. She smiled apologetically. But Emily felt hope rising again. There was an incident. What happened? A gentleman accidentally left a notebook here about 3 months ago. Emily's heart skipped. Maria disappeared into a storage room before returning with a small plastic evidence envelope. Inside rested a folded sheet of paper. Not a notebook. Just 1 page. We couldn't identify the owner. Emily carefully unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It was a hand-drawn map. At first it looked meaningless. Then Harris noticed something. These aren't streets. Emily studied it more closely. No. They're rail lines. Old railroads crossed the page in black ink. Some had been abandoned decades earlier. One route had been circled several times. It stretched north toward New Mexico. At the edge of the page Noah had written a single sentence. Some tracks disappear because people stop looking. Mitchell folded the paper carefully. He wanted someone to find this. Emily looked confused. But why leave clues instead of simply contacting me? No one answered. Because no one knew. As they prepared to leave, Maria stopped them. There is one more thing. She walked toward one of the reading rooms. Every Sunday. She pointed toward the same chair beside the window. He always sat there. Emily approached slowly. The chair faced the railroad tracks outside. Not the bookshelves. Not the entrance. The tracks. She stared through the glass. A freight train thundered past. Its horn echoed across the city. For just a second. She could almost imagine Noah sitting there, quietly watching trains come and go while waiting for something, or someone. Suddenly her phone vibrated. It was an unknown number. Mitchell nodded. Answer it. Emily pressed the phone to her ear. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then the same calm male voice from the prepaid phone returned. I see you found the library. Emily's entire body froze. Who are you? The man ignored the question. You're closer than you've ever been. Emily looked wildly around the room. Every stranger suddenly seemed suspicious. Where's Noah? A long silence followed. Finally, the man answered. He never stopped trying to come home. The call ended. Emily lowered the phone with trembling hands. Mitchell immediately signaled agents waiting outside the library. They traced the call. 30 seconds later, one of the agents returned. It's gone. What do you mean? The phone connected through a disposable satellite relay. No location. No signal. No trace. Emily looked back toward the empty chair beside the window. Someone had known exactly where she would be. Someone was staying one step ahead. But for the first time, she no longer doubted the impossible. Noah Bennett was alive. The only question left was, why had he spent 11 years hiding from the woman he loved? Emily didn't say a word during the drive back to the hotel. She sat in the back seat staring at the map they had found in the library, tracing the old railway line with her finger over and over again. Every clue seemed to point toward trains. The abandoned depot in Louisiana. The rail map. The motel beside the tracks. The library chair facing the railway. None of it could be a coincidence. Detective Harris noticed the pattern too. Noah wanted us following the railroad. Special Agent Mitchell nodded. The question is why? Emily looked out the window. He wasn't running. Both agents turned toward her. He was leading us. Back at the hotel, Mitchell spread the railway map across the conference table beside several modern transportation maps. Most of the route Noah had circled had been abandoned decades earlier. Only one section remained active. A freight line connecting Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Southern California. Harris studied the line carefully. If someone wanted to disappear, freight trains would make it surprisingly easy. Mitchell agreed. No passenger records. No security checkpoints. No digital tickets. Emily suddenly remembered something Noah had once told her during college. Whenever they crossed railroad bridges together, he would slow down just enough to watch the trains below. He believed railroads formed the hidden arteries of the country. They reach places highways never do, he had once explained. If you understand the tracks, you understand how America moves. At the time Emily thought he was simply fascinated by engineering. Now she wondered if those words had become something more. The following morning an FBI analyst called with another breakthrough. The financial documents recovered from Louisiana had finally been decrypted. One payment immediately stood out. Nearly 12 years earlier, just 3 days after the bridge collapse, an anonymous transfer had funded a small private medical clinic near the New Mexico border. The amount wasn't large. Only enough to cover emergency treatment for one unidentified patient. What made you notice it? Harris asked. The analyst answered immediately. The payment authorization. Emily leaned forward. It required a handwritten approval. And the signature belongs to Noah Bennett. The room fell silent. Emily slowly shook her head. That's impossible. It shouldn't exist, the analyst admitted. But our handwriting experts are 98% confident. Mitchell immediately arranged transportation. Within 3 hours they were driving west across endless desert highways. The clinic stood outside a tiny town surrounded by mountains. It consisted of only one building. Weathered white walls. A faded blue roof. A single ambulance parked beside the entrance. The elderly physician who owned the clinic introduced himself as Dr. Samuel Ortega. At first he refused to discuss former patients. Medical privacy laws prevented it. Only after Mitchell presented federal authorization did his expression slowly change. He studied Noah's old photograph for several long seconds. I remember him. Emily's heart nearly stopped. You do? He arrived unconscious. When? 12 years ago. Emily felt dizzy. He was alive. Dr. Ortega nodded. Barely. He'd suffered multiple fractures. A serious concussion. Severe hypothermia. He should have died. Emily struggled to breathe. Who brought him here? The doctor's face darkened. That's the strange part. No one knows. Mitchell frowned. What do you mean? We found him outside. Outside? Dr. Ortega walked toward an old photograph hanging on the clinic wall. It showed the building exactly as it had looked years earlier. He was lying right there. He pointed toward the entrance. No vehicle. No identification except an engineering license. No witnesses. Just, a man who appeared before sunrise. Emily whispered the question everyone feared. Did he remember who he was? The doctor's silence answered before his words did. No. Emily closed her eyes. Dr. Ortega continued gently. The head injury caused severe retrograde amnesia. He remembered mathematics. He remembered engineering. He remembered how to repair machinery. But he couldn't remember his own life. Emily felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath her. He didn't remember me. The doctor shook his head sadly. He didn't remember anyone. Tears filled Emily's eyes. For 11 years she had believed Noah chose not to come home. The truth was infinitely crueler. He hadn't known where home was. Dr. Ortega walked into a storage room before returning with an old medical file. I almost threw this away several years ago. Inside were rehabilitation notes written by Noah himself. His handwriting grew steadier week by week. The earliest entries contained only practical observations. Walked 20 meters today. Memory still blank. Nightmares continue. Months later the notes became more personal. I know someone is missing me. I don't know why I know that. Sometimes I dream about a woman standing beside the ocean. Emily began crying silently. Black Harbor Lighthouse. Even without memories. Some part of Noah had still remembered her. Dr. Ortega turned another page. The dreams became more frequent. Emily read the final paragraph. I still don't know her name. But every time I wake up, I feel like I've broken a promise. Emily could no longer hold back her tears. She covered her face with both hands. Harris quietly placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Mitchell remained focused on the file. What happened after he recovered? Dr. Ortega sighed. He stayed here nearly 8 months. He worked around the clinic repairing equipment. He read engineering books. He tried everything to recover his memory. And then, one morning, the doctor smiled faintly. He simply said he needed to keep traveling. Did he explain why? He said someone was waiting. Emily looked up immediately. But he didn't know who. No. Dr. Ortega smiled sadly. He only knew that somewhere in the world, someone deserved an explanation. The room fell completely silent. For the first time since this journey began, Emily understood. Noah hadn't been hiding from her. He had been searching for himself. And somehow, for all those years, his heart had remembered a promise. Long before his mind remembered the woman who inspired it. Emily couldn't stop reading the letter. She had memorized every line within minutes, yet her eyes kept returning to the same sentence. Every mile I travel is a mile back to you. For 11 years she had believed Noah had abandoned her. Now she knew the truth. Every decision he had made had been to protect her. The realization hurt more than the lie ever had. Detective Harris carefully folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope. He knew they were still watching. Dr. Ortega nodded. Even after parts of his memory returned, he refused to tell anyone where he planned to go. Emily wiped away her tears. He must have been terrified. He was, the doctor replied. But not for himself. The room fell silent. After a few moments, Dr. Ortega walked to an old filing cabinet and pulled out another folder. I almost forgot about this. Inside was a faded photograph. It showed Noah standing outside the clinic nearly 10 years earlier. He looked thinner than Emily remembered, with a bandage still visible beneath his shirt collar. Standing beside him was a woman in her 50s with warm eyes and a gentle smile. Emily had never seen her before. Who's she? Sarah Whitmore, Dr. Ortega answered. She volunteered here after the hurricane. She became Noah's closest friend during his recovery. Detective Harris looked at the photograph. Do you know where she is now? I did. The doctor sighed. She operated a community shelter near the Texas border for several years. And now? She closed it about 6 months ago. Emily exchanged a glance with Harris. 6 months. The same time investigators believed someone had reopened the hidden storage case in Louisiana. The same time the mysterious fingerprints had appeared. The same time Noah's identity had been used at the medical clinic. Nothing about that timeline felt accidental. Did Sarah ever mention where she was going? Mitchell asked. Dr. Ortega shook his head. Only that she had one last promise to keep. Emily frowned. What promise? The doctor smiled sadly. She never told me. Harris immediately contacted the FBI. Within an hour, agents began searching for Sarah Whitmore. There weren't many records. She had lived quietly. Paid cash whenever possible. Owned no property. Had no active social media accounts. It was almost as if she wanted to disappear. Late that afternoon, one of the agents called. We found her vehicle registration. Everyone looked up. Where? Montana. Emily blinked. Montana. The agent continued. A pickup truck was registered to Sarah Whitmore 5 months ago near Glacier National Park. Mitchell immediately opened a map. The cabin sat in one of the most isolated parts of the state. Miles from the nearest town. Surrounded by forests and mountains. Perfect for someone who didn't want to be found. As Harris organized the trip, Emily wandered outside the clinic. The desert sun had begun to set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and red. She sat alone on a weathered wooden bench. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine Noah alive. Was his hair longer now? Did he still smile the same way? Would he recognize her immediately? Or had time changed both of them too much? She reached into her pocket and unfolded the letter again. This time she noticed something she had missed before. In the lower right corner, Noah had drawn a tiny lighthouse. Just a simple sketch. 4 quick lines. A beam of light stretching across the page. Emily smiled through her tears. Black Harbor Lighthouse. Even after losing his memories. Even after years of searching for himself. Some part of him had never forgotten the place where they had promised to build a future together. She carefully folded the letter and looked toward the horizon. For 11 years she had been searching for closure. Instead, she had found hope. The next morning, Emily, Detective Harris, and Special Agent Mitchell boarded a flight to Montana. None of them knew what they would find. They only knew one thing. If Sarah Whitmore had spent the last several years helping Noah, then she might be the final person standing between Emily and the man she had never truly stopped loving. The flight to Montana left before sunrise. Emily barely noticed the passengers around her. Sarah Whitmore. For the last 24 hours, that name had become the center of everything. Detective Harris had learned that after closing the community shelter in Texas, Sarah purchased a small cabin near Glacier National Park using cash. No forwarding address. No social media. No public records after that. It looked less like someone moving and more like someone disappearing. Emily stared through the airplane window. If Noah is there. Harris looked at her quietly. What will you say? She opened her mouth. Then closed it again. For 11 years she had imagined this moment. She had rehearsed hundreds of conversations. Accusations. Questions. Tears. Forgiveness. Now she realized none of those words mattered anymore. I think. She smiled sadly. I'll just say hello. The cabin stood alone beside a frozen lake. Snow covered the roof. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. The surrounding forest was silent except for the wind moving through the pine trees. Mitchell signaled for everyone to remain behind her before knocking on the door. No answer. She knocked again. Footsteps echoed inside. The door slowly opened. A woman in her early 50s stood before them. Gray strands mixed with dark hair. Kind eyes. A tired smile. Emily recognized her immediately from the old photograph. Sarah. The woman looked from Mitchell's badge to Emily's face. Then her expression completely changed. Emily. Emily nodded. Sarah closed her eyes. Oh, Noah. She stepped aside. You should come in. The cabin was warm and filled with books. Engineering drawings covered a large wooden table. Half-finished bridge models stood beside old photography equipment. Emily immediately noticed one thing. Every design looked familiar. Not identical. But unmistakably Noah's style. Strong. Practical. Elegant. Sarah watched her quietly. He never stopped designing. Emily could barely breathe. Where is he? Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she poured everyone coffee before sitting across from them. I've known this day would come. Mitchell leaned forward. Then you know why we're here. Sarah nodded. Yes. She looked directly at Emily. He wanted to come home. Emily whispered. I know. Sarah smiled sadly. No, you don't. She explained everything. She had met Noah 12 years earlier while volunteering at Dr. Ortega's clinic. He remembered nothing. Not even his own name. She helped him recover. When fragments of memory returned, Noah became obsessed with understanding why the bridge had collapsed. At first Sarah believed it was simply survivor's guilt. Then Noah discovered evidence. The same evidence Emily had eventually found. He realized powerful people had arranged the sabotage. Several witnesses connected to the case disappeared over the following years. One engineer died in what police called a traffic accident. Another vanished completely. Noah became convinced that anyone close to him could become a target. Especially Emily. So he stayed away. Not because he stopped loving her. Because loving her meant keeping her alive. He hated every day of it, Sarah said quietly. He wrote your name almost every night. Emily looked toward the fireplace. On the mantel stood a stack of notebooks. Dozens of them. Sarah followed her gaze. They're all for you. Emily carefully opened the first journal. Every page began the same way. Dear Emily. 11 years. 11 journals. Thousands of pages. A lifetime written to someone who never received a single letter. Tears quietly rolled down her face. Finally Emily asked the only question that still mattered. Where is he? Sarah looked toward the frozen lake outside. He left 3 weeks ago. Emily felt her heart sink. Where? He finally remembered everything. Nobody moved. Sarah continued. When the FBI reopened the investigation, he realized it was finally safe. Emily stood. So why isn't he here? Sarah smiled through tears. Because he wanted to surprise you. Silence filled the room. He drove to Boston. Emily stared at her. What? He believed you'd still be living there. Detective Harris immediately reached for his phone. No signal. Mitchell checked hers. Nothing. The mountains blocked almost every network. Emily laughed despite the tears. After everything. They had crossed the entire country. While Noah had been traveling in the opposite direction. 2 days later they finally reached Boston. Emily had never been so afraid. What if she had missed him? What if he had already left again? The taxi stopped outside her apartment building. She ran before anyone could stop her. Up the stairs. Down the familiar hallway. She froze. Someone stood outside her apartment door. A man with dark hair now touched by gray. A worn winter coat. A small travel bag resting beside his feet. His hand hovered over the doorbell as though he had spent several minutes trying to find the courage to ring it. He turned at the sound of footsteps. For several seconds neither of them moved. Time simply stopped. Noah looked older. Life had left its marks across his face. A thin scar crossed his forehead. His shoulders seemed heavier. But his eyes. Emily knew those eyes instantly. Noah whispered her name as though saying it too loudly might make her disappear. Emily. She nodded. Neither smiled. Neither cried. Not yet. He took one uncertain step forward. I've practiced this moment, for 11 years. His voice broke. Emily closed the distance between them without saying a word. She wrapped both arms around him. He held her as though letting go would mean losing her all over again. For a long time neither of them spoke. The silence said everything. Finally Noah whispered. I'm sorry. Emily gently shook her head. No. She looked into his eyes. You came home. Nothing else mattered. 1 year later, the federal investigation resulted in multiple convictions. Several executives responsible for the disaster reconstruction fraud received lengthy prison sentences. Families finally learned the truth about what had happened during the hurricane. Noah testified in court. Not as a victim. As a witness. When the trials ended, he declined every television interview, every book offer, and every documentary. Instead, he accepted a position teaching structural engineering at a small university in Maine. Emily opened her own architectural studio overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Every Sunday morning they drove to Black Harbor Lighthouse. Just as Emily had done with her father decades earlier. They climbed the spiral staircase. Shared sandwiches. Watched ships disappear beyond the horizon. One spring afternoon Noah quietly reached into his pocket. The same silver engagement ring. He had carried it for 11 years. I know I'm late. Emily laughed through tears. Just a little. He smiled. So, would you still marry me? She looked toward the endless ocean. Then back at the man who had spent more than a decade trying to keep a promise he couldn't even remember making. Her answer was exactly the same as it had been all those years ago. Yes. 6 months later they were married in the shadow of Black Harbor Lighthouse. No grand ballroom. No hundreds of guests. Only family. Close friends. The sound of waves. And 2 people who had learned that love isn't measured by the years you spend together. But by the promises you never stop trying to keep.